All right, welcome back here. We're starting lesson two here, and I just wanted to kind of bring you to one of the key aspects of sociology. So I'm zooming in here on a section I have of sort of the founding fathers of sociology. So these are the individuals who are noted as being the actual reason that sociology exists. And so I kind of want to trace this history just a little bit, and then I want to give you the three big sociologists. Now, um, there's a reason for this, and there's a good reason. This is the only chapter that we're going to spend actual two lessons on. And the reason is that the foundations of this, the three perspectives that we'll talk about here a little bit, and the three sociologists that we'll talk about, you're going to see them over and over and over and over again in the course. So if I can give you any advice, it is the last half of that first chapter when they start talking about the sociologists, the big three sociologists, as well as the theoretical perspectives. That's section 1.3. That's what you want to focus on, because that's not something that's one and done, meaning you're going to see those. It's going to be expected that you know those concepts all the way throughout this text. So I just want to give you a heads up on that. Okay, so let's look at who's seen as the first sociologist, a Frenchman named Auguste Comte. And so you can see his last name there. He's famous for a few reasons. For one, he's the individual who actually is credited. The book gets us a little bit confused, I think, or at least there's some debate over this. But Comte is really the person who comes up with the term sociology. He's the first person to really use it, and that's all that really matters. So he'll forever be famous because of that. Additionally, Comte was extremely important because he's the first person to really come out and actually say what sociology is. And that is, he said this should be the scientific study of the social world. Now, for all of Comte's positives there, his big negative was that he didn't actually do what he said. He never really was a scientist. He never explored the world sort of scientifically. He kind of fell back on philosophy, but he is the individual who gets things rolling. The first guy who really started, this isn't him by the way, but the first guy who really got things started was an Englishman named Herbert Spencer. And Herbert Spencer puts together the first scientific sort of theory related to the social world. And you're probably familiar with one of the concepts that Spencer actually came up with. Many people attribute it to Darwin, but it wasn't Darwin. It was actually Spencer who came up with this survival of the fittest. And so for Spencer in his world, he put forward the theory, essentially, that this notion of social, sort of, in some ways, social evolution. That is, Spencer really kind of thought that the world operated in this way. So go back to last week or last lesson when I talked about those factories. Spencer was of the idea that the strong will survive. The smartest, the strongest, the most powerful will find a way to survive. And that's what you want in society. And so for Spencer, he sort of developed this idea that if you were poor, if you were weak, if you were not as smart as someone else, that, he wasn't too worried about you. So, for example, if you were a child in a factory, he would say, well, the strongest ones will work their way out and they won't be stuck in those jobs. If you lose a hand or an arm as a child, tough, that's just survival of the fittest. So, Spencer was important because he was trying to put together some scientific theories. In large part, though, Herbert Spencer failed because his work, at least on the social world and this notion of social evolution, is largely discredited. Not to be confused with natural selection in the animal world and the animal kingdom, as far as genetic sort of mutations and how things change over time. That's that's well established scientifically. He's talking about specifically amongst humans interacting, and this just doesn't have a lot of support. Okay, so here we get to the guys who really stuck around. I mean, these are the guys who you really need to kind of focus on. The first I'm going to look at here may be the only one. If you've heard of any of these three guys and you've never taken a sociology class, this will probably be the guy you've heard of. The first one here is Karl Marx, and that's who you may have heard of. Karl Marx was not only a sociologist, he's an early sociologist, he was also an economist, he's also a political scientist, he was also involved in social change. So Marx was one of these guys who was doing a lot of things. And from a sociological standpoint, what makes Marx so important is he puts forward one of the perspectives that your book talks about called conflict theory. And I'm going to give you just a short summary of conflict theory, but you should spend some time reading about it. Conflict theory says that there are groups who are in conflict over these limited resources. So, in other words, there's never enough money, there's never enough power, there's never enough anything so that everyone can have everything they want. So those are those limited resources, and he says these groups are fighting over those limited resources. Not always physically, but they are competing for these resources. And so he puts forward this conflict theory that essentially says that you always have groups in conflict. Now, the two that Marx really talked about primarily were what we might call the upper class and the lower class. He called them, the upper class he called the bourgeoisie, and the lower class the proletariat. You'd think of them as the rich and the poor, the working class and the wealthy. There's a lot of synonyms here, but you get the idea that essentially there's a group of people who have a lot and most people who have very little. And so what Marx said was that there was this inherent conflict that was going on. Now, I'll just jump ahead a little bit and mention that Marx did say that, in the long run, what would be sort of great would be if that conflict no longer existed, if things were a little more equal, a little more fair. I can't say he was optimistic that would ever happen, but that may be where you heard of Marx from, because Marx becomes seen as the founding father of socialism or communism, this idea that there's too much inequality. So that's sort of a basic introduction to the first of the big three. The other one, the next of the big three, is a guy named Durkheim, Emile Durkheim. He was a Frenchman. Durkheim starts a perspective that we call functionalism. And so for Durkheim, he thought of the world differently than Marx. In fact, what Durkheim said about the world was that everything serves some function or purpose if it exists. That's where this idea of functionalism comes from. So just think about that. What he's saying is, if something exists, it must serve some function or purpose. Now, where he borrowed this idea from was from the biological sciences, so from biology and such. See if I have the image on here. I don't, unfortunately. But think of a human body. And what Durkheim said is, society was like a human body, like an organism. And he said there's these pieces that make up your organism. So for the body, the important parts are your organs, things like your heart, your lungs, your liver, your kidneys, all the organs that we have. And of course, what happens if one of those break? What happens if an organ stops working? If the lungs stop working or the heart stops working? Well, as you know in biology or biologically, what happens is the whole organism will die. And Durkheim thought of society that way as well. And so instead of it being the human body, Instead of having those individual organs, he thought of all the pieces that make up society as the organs. So, for example, these are important parts of society. The family is one of the organs of society. The military, politics, education, an economy. These are all the different pieces that make up society. And Durkheim said they must all serve some function. That is, they don't exist just accidentally. So he thought of it in sort of this functional perspective. What purpose does it serve? So as you think of functionalism, always ask yourself that question. What purpose does it serve? I mean, what purpose does poverty serve? What purpose does crime serve? And for functionalists, there's an answer to that. They say it serves some purpose. So you'll see more of that coming up. One of the things I do want to sort of mention here is how this sort of ties to the science part. Durkheim really focused on what he called social facts. You can see that right there. And a social fact is something that is inherently true about your society or about your culture. And what Durkheim said is what we should do is we should find out those social facts, find out what is true. And that is, what he meant is, what can we measure that's actually true? And then once we have those social facts, we find those things that are true, then we can try to find the explanation for why it's true. So this is where sort of the science comes in. So let me give you sort of a fun one here. Let's see if I have it on here. Sorry for the jumping around. There we go. So here's an interesting one for you. What is the most common day for women to give birth? What's the most common day of the week? Right? So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. What's the most common day for women to give birth? Now, the answer to this question is a social fact. That is, it's true, we can measure it, this is true. And in the United States, the most common day for women to give birth is now Wednesday. So women are something like 30% more likely to give birth on Wednesday than they are on Saturday or Sunday. So that's a social fact. Women are more likely to give birth on a Wednesday. Now, biologically, if we just let nature run its course, we would expect women to be equally likely to give birth every day. But that's not the case in the United States. So the question becomes why? We can actually look at that answer, or we can look at that question probably relating to our healthcare system, right? We've seen an increase in births being scheduled now, whether it's cesarean or induced labor. And probably what you'll never hear a doctor say is, boy, I want to induce you on Sunday, Saturday, right? Because those are, as we all know, the holy days of golf for many doctors. So if you think about it, what happened is doctors tend to be scheduling a lot more of these procedures, and they schedule them in the middle of the week, perhaps so that if they have any problems, they can have it taken care of by the weekend. So there's a lot of reasons, but that is an example of a social fact. Women are more likely to give birth on Wednesday than any other day. Now, what Durkheim did, he did one of the most famous early studies, and he found a lot of things that are still true today. Durkheim started asking, why do people commit suicide? So he wondered, why is it that people commit suicide? And what Durkheim found was pretty interesting. Now, mostly when we think of something like suicide, we probably think, or you may think, of why do people do it? And the thing that pops in our mind tends to be psychological sort of things. In other words, people say, well, you're depressed, anxiety, maybe they were getting bullied. But we tend to think of suicide as something related to psychology. And Durkheim said, well, that's true. He didn't argue that that wasn't true. But he said maybe. Looking around, he saw people in different places were more or less likely to commit suicide. And he said maybe there's some sociological factors related to suicide. So he collected a lot of this data back in the old days But I'm going to show you some more recent data so you can see some of the things that Durkheim found out. Durkheim, for example, found out that people in different parts of, uh, of Europe at the time were more or less likely to commit suicide. And looking at the United States, and this is from 1996, the numbers are pretty similar today. But looking at the United States in 1996, this shows the rate of suicides per 100,000 people by state or district. And you can see that the state with the highest suicide rate is Alaska, with 20 per 100,000 people. The state or area with the lowest is the District of Columbia, followed by, sorry, I'm not sure why that popped up there. We'll just have to ignore that. Followed by New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Illinois, and Ohio is actually towards the bottom there. So if you look at those states, and you kind of say, why is it people are most likely to commit suicide in somewhere like Alaska, Nevada, Montana, New Mexico? And there's a couple things that Durkheim noticed. And of course, he wasn't using the United States, but he noticed something, that suicide was oftentimes related to physically, literally how close you were to other people. And so in places where you had a lot of people, places like Washington, D.C., right, which is really just one big city, New York, which has the biggest city in America there, New York City, New Jersey, which has a lot of population, very concentrated, Massachusetts, same thing. Those are places where you have a lot of people in a small area. On the other hand, if you get to these places like Alaska, Nevada, Montana, those are places where people are very spread out. In Alaska, of course, the least populated state as far as how big it is. Nevada, Montana, same thing. Not a lot of people. People are spread out. And so he found out that if you were physically further away from other people, you were more likely to commit suicide. And that seems to be true even in the United States today. Let me also look at this. How about gender and age? This is always a big shock for students, oftentimes at least. If I was to ask you who is most likely to commit suicide, which age group of people are most likely to commit suicide, you might think teenagers, early 20s. But actually, when we look at suicide rates by age, you can see that the older one is, the more likely one is to commit suicide. This is another example of where common sense kind of goes wrong. People, when young men and women, children kill themselves, teenagers kill themselves, that makes the news. People pay attention to it. So we hear about this group. It's of course, very tragic when anyone does it, but very tragic oftentimes because these teenagers don't realize that, for example, bullying and that kind of stuff that goes on in high school, perhaps in junior high, that does come to an end when you get out into the real world. And so it is sort of tragic, and it makes a lot of news. But actually, of course, if we look at age, we see that the older one is, the more likely one is to commit suicide. Now, Durkheim explained this as well. Durkheim is saying that you're more connected in your younger years, and part of this is that you of course, you have family, you're living with spouses and children, etc., siblings and such. And as you get older, of course, especially when you start getting up into the elderly years, family starts to fall away. That is, they start dying, people pass away, and so we oftentimes see people becoming more and more disconnected. I'm sure you've seen the stories of people who are shut-ins, can't get out of the house because of health conditions, and so people become less sort of connected. He also mentioned way back in the days, and it's still true today, that men are less connected than women. Women tend to have more social connections to other people. This is probably part of the training, part of our culture. We train young girls and then women to be more socially interactive. That is, they have more connections with family members usually, more connections with in-laws, those sort of things. So Durkheim noticed that. Lastly, I just want to mention this, and it's always kind of a joke in class. Who's most likely to commit suicide? Married people or never married people or divorced people? And there's always someone who jokes, well, married people, of course, the one's most likely to commit suicide. And that's not true. I mean, you can see by this data, and Arizona just put this together, so this is still true everywhere. But married people are much less likely to commit suicide, for example, than those who are divorced and those who are widowed. So, as we lose those social connections, we're more likely to commit suicide. Um, Durkheim said this was all important, and his big study when he did this study on suicide, he said it's all about really what he called social integration, how socially connected people are to other people, to their society, to their culture. And the more connected you are, the less likely you are to commit suicide. Very different than sort of the psychological approach, because he's really looking at sociological variables. Okay, so he's sort of the functionalist. Now, the last guy is a guy named Weber, who is somewhat associated with the third perspective we call symbolic interactionism. So, just in case you see this written down, Weber is spelled W-E-B-E-R, but it's pronounced Weber because it's German, so there's a V sound in there. So if you're seeing it and you're confused there, that's what it is. So, Weber, very important early sociologist as well. His work ends up leading to what comes along later that's called symbolic interactionism. And so you'll see more about these individuals, read a little bit more about them. Let me mention symbolic interactionism real quick. Symbolic interactionism is a little bit different than conflict theory and functionalism, which you just heard about. Symbolic interactionism focuses on very small groups. It's a micro theory. So, symbolic interactionists are much more likely to look at what happens when groups are interacting sort of at the smaller level. So, for example, how does a family operate? Who listens to who tells who what to do? How do kids, do they follow the rules? Do they not? And why? And so, they'd want to go in and actually find out why, find out how and why. So symbolic interactionists, that at their sort of core level, they focus on symbols. And it's in the term there. It's how we interact with symbols. And symbols are things like language, signs, like a stop sign. But the most important of these are language, which is symbols. And so how do we interact with those things? How do we use those things? Like, how do we use language to get people to do what we want them to do, etc.? So, symbolic interactionist is more of a micro theory, where the other two, conflict theory, who is with Marx, and functionalism, who was started by Durkheim, those are really macro theories that kind of look at society as a whole. So, I know this may sound a little confusing. I just wanted to kind of give you a little start on this. But go ahead and read through those sections. And you spend some extra time on those big three sociologists and on the three perspectives. It'll be well worth your while going forward. So, once again, lesson 2. So, you're starting to get into the flow of things. Like I said, go back to that schedule. Make sure you're following along. Make sure you get all those assignments done. That's the most important thing. Kind of discipline yourself to set some time aside to do your studying and your reading, and get everything done. And don't forget, everything in here except for the exams is due Sunday at 9 p.m. Your first discussion post should be up by Thursday at 9, and then your reply should be up by Sunday. That gives everyone a chance to see other people's responses and reply. But additionally, everything is pretty much due Sunday at 9 p.m. I give you an extra day for the exams, which means you actually have till Monday at 9 to finish those off. And so you'll have your first exam probably after lesson 4 here. But if there's any question, of course, you can turn to that schedule that's in the Start Here folder. All right, guys. Y'all have a fantastic week out there, and I'll see you next lesson.